Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a crime storytelling series for sleeping, where crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. Tonight we have a mix of stories for you all. Let's go. Story 1, The Chicago Rose. Detective Sergeant Michael O'Brien stubbed out his cigarette and pulled his fedora low against the bitter March wind as he stood outside the Roseland Ballroom on South Michigan Avenue. The neon sign flickered weakly in the gray dawn light, its cheerful promise of dancing every night, now seeming grimly ironic given what lay inside. The call had come in at 5:30 that morning. A body discovered in the ballroom's basement speakeasy, and not just any body. Rose Delacroix, the singer whose sultry voice had made the Roseland one of Chicago's most popular underground establishments. Rose had been found sprawled across the stage, a single bullet wound to the chest, her signature red dress now stained with something darker than rouge. O'Brien had been a detective for 8 years, since returning from the trenches of France, but the sight of Rose's lifeless form still gave him pause. She couldn't have been more than 25, with platinum blonde hair and the kind of beauty that could stop traffic on State Street. Now she lay covered by a police blanket, another casualty of Chicago's ongoing war between rival bootlegging operations. "What do we know, Murphy?" O'Brien asked his partner, Detective James Murphy, who was interviewing the ballroom's janitor near the bar. Murphy closed his notebook and approached. "Victim is Rose Delacroix, real name Rosa DeMarco from Little Italy. 24 years old, been singing here about 6 months. Body was discovered by the janitor, Frank Kowalski, when he came in to clean up around 5 this morning. Time of death? Coroner estimates between midnight and 2 a.m. Single gunshot to the chest, close range. Looks like a .38, though we won't know for sure until the autopsy." O'Brien surveyed the basement speakeasy. Despite prohibition, places like this operated openly in Chicago, protected by a complex web of bribes and political connections. The Roseland's underground room was typical of the genre. Small round tables, a modest stage, and a bar that could be quickly concealed behind a false wall if federal agents came calling. "Any witnesses?" "That's where it gets interesting," Murphy said, lighting a cigarette. "The place was packed last night for Rose's regular Saturday show. Must have been 60, 70 people down here. But according to Kowalski, everyone cleared out fast when they heard the gunshot. By the time he got down here, the place was empty except for Rose." "What about the ballroom upstairs?" "Closed at 11:30, same as always. The speakeasy usually stays open until 3 or 4 on Saturday nights. Frank says he was upstairs cleaning the main ballroom when he heard what sounded like a car backfiring around midnight. Didn't think much of it until he came down later and found the body." O'Brien walked over to examine the stage more closely. Rose had fallen backward, her arms outstretched, as if she'd been shot while performing. Her microphone lay nearby, the cord tangled around her legs. But something about the scene bothered him. "Murphy, look at this. If someone shot her from the audience, she would have fallen backward off the stage. But she's positioned right in the center, as if she was standing there talking to someone. Maybe the shooter was someone she knew, called her over to the edge of the stage?" "Possible. What about the exits?" Murphy consulted his notes. 3 ways out of here. The main stairs we came down, a service entrance that leads to the alley, and an emergency exit that connects to the hotel next door. All 3 were unlocked when Frank found the body." The Roseland was owned by Tony Torino, one of Chicago's more successful bootleggers. Unlike the violent Capone organization or the Irish gangs on the north side, Torino ran a relatively peaceful operation, focusing on high-quality liquor and upscale establishments. But even peaceful bootleggers had enemies in 1923 Chicago. "We need to talk to Torino," O'Brien said, "and I want to know more about Rose. A girl doesn't just show up in Chicago and start singing in speakeasies without a history." They found Tony Torino at his legitimate business, Torino's restaurant on Taylor Street in Little Italy. Despite the early hour, the restaurant was busy with the breakfast crowd. Dock workers, policemen, and businessmen all sharing tables and conversation in the warm, garlic-scented air. Torino himself was a small, dapper man in his 50s, with silver hair and expensive clothes that couldn't quite disguise his working-class origins. He received the news of Rose's death with what appeared to be genuine shock and grief. Rose was like a daughter to me, he said, crossing himself. She came to Chicago with nothing, just a beautiful voice and dreams of making it big. I gave her a chance when nobody else would. Where did she come from? O'Brien asked. New York originally, but she'd been traveling around. Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. Said she was looking for the right opportunity to showcase her talent. Any enemies? Jealous lovers? Business disputes? Torino shook his head emphatically. Rose kept to herself mostly. She was professional, always on time, never caused trouble. The customers loved her. What about competition from other establishments? Anyone trying to poach her? There's always competition in this business, detective. But Rose was exclusive to the Roseland. She had a contract. Murphy leaned forward. Mr. Torino, we have to ask, are you having any disputes with rival organizations? Anyone who might target your business? Business is good, Detective Murphy. I pay my taxes. I pay my other obligations. I don't look for trouble. But O'Brien noticed Torino's hands were trembling slightly as he spoke. The man was nervous about something beyond Rose's death. After leaving the restaurant, the detectives decided to learn more about Rose's background. Their first stop was Mrs. Julia Benedetto, the elderly Italian woman who rented rooms to young performers in a boarding house near the Roseland. Mrs. Benedetto was a tiny woman in black who spoke heavily accented English, peppered with Italian phrases. She had clearly been crying. Rose had been one of her favorites. She was a good girl, detective. Quiet, polite, always paid her rent on time. Not like some of these jazz singers who think they're too good for decent people. Did she have any visitors? Boyfriends? There was one young man who came around sometimes. Very handsome, well-dressed. Rose called him Johnny, but I think that wasn't his real name. He had an automobile. Very fancy. Can you describe him? Tall, dark hair, maybe 30 years old. He dressed like a businessman, but had scars on his hands like he'd been in fights. Rose seemed nervous when he visited. When was the last time you saw him? Mrs. Benedetto thought for a moment. Maybe 2 weeks ago. Rose seemed upset after he left. She asked me if I knew anywhere else she could live, somewhere more private. This was the first suggestion that Rose might have been in some kind of trouble. O'Brien made a note to investigate this mysterious Johnny further. Their next stop was the Roseland itself, where they hoped to interview some of the regular customers and staff. The ballroom manager, a nervous man named Eddie Kowalski, Frank the janitor's cousin, provided them with a list of Saturday night regulars. Rose had her fans, you know, Eddie explained. Same people came every week just to hear her sing. She had this way of making everyone feel like she was singing just for them. Anyone in particular who seemed overly interested in her? Well, there was this businessman, Mr. Williams. Always sat at the front table, always sent her drinks, left big tips for the waitresses, but he seemed like a gentleman. What did Mr. Williams look like? Maybe 40, graying hair, expensive suits, drove a Packard, real class act. O'Brien and Murphy exchanged glances. Two different men showing interest in Rose, both with expensive cars and mysterious backgrounds. Anyone else we should know about? Eddie hesitated. There was some trouble a few weeks back. This guy came in, said he was Rose's husband, wanted to take her away. Rose got real upset, said she didn't know him. Tony had to have him thrown out. Can you describe this man? Big guy, maybe 6 feet tall, looked like he worked with his hands, had a scar across his left cheek. Rose was shaking like a leaf after he left. The picture was becoming clearer but also more complicated. Rose Delacroix had apparently been running from something or someone in her past, and it seemed to have caught up with her in Chicago. That afternoon, O'Brien decided to investigate Rose's room at Mrs. Benedetto's boarding house. The landlady led them up 2 flights of narrow stairs to a small but tidy room overlooking the street. Rose's belongings were few but revealing. Her wardrobe consisted mainly of performance dresses and a few modest day outfits. But hidden in a suitcase under the bed, O'Brien found something interesting, a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. The letters were from someone named Vincent Marconi in New York, and they painted a disturbing picture of Rose's life before Chicago. Vincent claimed to be her common-law husband and demanded that she return to New York immediately. The letters grew increasingly threatening, with the most recent one promising to bring you back myself if necessary. Looks like our mysterious husband has a name, Murphy observed. But there was more. At the bottom of the suitcase, wrapped in a silk scarf, was a small .3 2-caliber revolver and several newspaper clippings about a robbery in Detroit 6 months earlier. The headlines told the story of a jewelry store heist in which a security guard had been killed. The suspects included a woman described as young, attractive, with blonde hair and a distinctive scar on her left shoulder. O'Brien examined Rose's stage dresses more carefully and found what he was looking for: subtle alterations to conceal scarring on the left shoulder area. Murphy, I think our Rose was more than just a singer running from a bad marriage. You think she was involved in this Detroit job? It's starting to look that way. The question is, who killed her and why? Was it revenge for the robbery, or was someone trying to silence her? Their investigation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the boarding house window, they could see a black Cadillac parked at the curb and 2 men in expensive overcoats getting out. Mrs. Benedetto appeared at the bedroom door, wringing her hands. Detective, there are men downstairs asking about Rose. They say they're her family, but they don't look like family to me. O'Brien drew his service revolver and motioned for Murphy to take the back stairs. Mrs. Benedetto, go to your room and lock the door. Don't come out until we call for you. The 2 men had made themselves comfortable in Mrs. Benedetto's parlor. The older one, a heavy-set man with gray hair and cold eyes, was examining Rose's mail from the hall table. The younger man stood by the window, clearly acting as a lookout. Gentlemen, O'Brien announced his presence, badge in one hand, gun in the other. Chicago police. I'll need to see some identification. The older man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, officer. I'm Vincent Marconi, and this is my associate, Mr. Rossetti. We're here about my wife, Rosa. Your wife is dead, Mr. Marconi. Murdered last night. Marconi's expression didn't change. That's unfortunate. We came to bring her home. From New York? That's right. Rosa ran away from her responsibilities. It's time she faced the consequences of her actions. Murphy appeared in the doorway behind Rossetti, his gun drawn. Detroit might be more interested in talking to her than New York. Now Marconi's composure cracked slightly. What do you know about Detroit? We know about the jewelry store robbery. We know about the dead security guard. And we know Rose had a scar on her shoulder that matches the suspect description. Marconi stood up slowly, his hands visible. Detective, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Rosa was never involved in any robbery. She was with me in New York the entire time. Then you won't mind coming down to the station to make a formal statement? I'm afraid that won't be possible. We have urgent business elsewhere. The tension in the room was building when the situation was resolved by an unexpected arrival. Tony Torino walked through the front door, flanked by 2 large men who were obviously bodyguards. Vincent, Torino said calmly, I thought I might find you here. Tony? I heard about Rosa. Terrible business. Yes, it is, especially since you're the one who killed her. The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Marconi's face flushed red. That's a serious charge, Tony. Can you prove it? I can prove you were at the Roseland last night. My bartender remembers serving you whiskey around 11:30. You waited until Rose finished her set, then followed her backstage. O'Brien kept his gun trained on Marconi while absorbing this new information. Mr. Torino, why didn't you mention this earlier? I needed to be sure. After you left the restaurant, I made some calls. Vincent here has been looking for Rosa for months. Seems she took something that belonged to him when she left New York. The jewelry from the Detroit job? Murphy asked. Marconi laughed bitterly. You think this is about jewelry? This is about betrayal, detective. Rosa was my partner in every sense of the word. We planned jobs together, worked together, shared everything. Then she decided she wanted out of the life and took my nest egg with her. $50,000 that was supposed to be our retirement fund. So you tracked her down and killed her? I came to Chicago to bring her home to work things out. I went to the speakeasy last night to talk to her. But Rosa, she'd changed. Success had gone to her head. She said she was finished with the old life, finished with me. Said she'd rather die than go back to New York? Marconi's voice broke slightly. So I gave her what she wanted. The confession was simple and direct, but O'Brien sensed there was more to the story. What happened to the money, Marconi? Gone. Rosa spent it all on clothes, jewelry, this new life she was building. Said it was the price of her freedom. Tony Torino shook his head sadly. Vincent, you always were too emotional for this business. A smart man would have walked away. Easy for you to say, Tony. You've got your restaurants, your legitimate businesses. All I had was Rosa, and she threw it away for applause and stage lights. The arrest of Vincent Marconi was accomplished without further violence, though Rossetti made a brief attempt to reach for his gun before being persuaded otherwise by Torino's bodyguards. Both New York men were taken to Chicago police headquarters for questioning. In the interrogation room, Marconi provided a full confession to Rosa's murder, along with details about their criminal partnership that stretched back 3 years. They had been involved in jewelry store robberies across the Midwest, with Rose acting as the inside scout who would case potential targets while posing as a customer. She was perfect for it, Marconi explained. Beautiful, charming. Nobody suspected a singer of planning robberies. We were going to pull one last big job and retire somewhere warm. What changed? Chicago changed her. The applause, the attention, being treated like she was special instead of just another criminal. She started believing her own act. When did you realize she'd taken your money? About 2 months after she disappeared. I went to our safety deposit box in New York and found it empty. $50,000, just gone. That was my life savings, detective. Everything I'd worked for. The Detroit robbery had indeed been their work, but according to Marconi, the security guard's death had been accidental. Rose had been shocked by the violence and began talking about leaving the criminal life behind. She said she wanted to be respectable, to use her singing voice for something legitimate. I thought it was just the shock talking, that she'd get over it. But she kept talking about going straight, finding some small town where nobody knew us. Why Chicago? She had a contact here, someone who promised her work in a legitimate nightclub. Turned out to be Tony Torino, though I don't think she knew about his other business interests when she first contacted him. The investigation revealed that Rose had indeed tried to go legitimate, but had been drawn into Torino's organization almost by accident. Her talent was genuine, and her desire to escape her criminal past was real. But the money she'd taken from Marconi had allowed her to live well while establishing her new identity, creating the very lifestyle that made her reluctant to return to New York. She was trying to buy respectability, O'Brien observed to Murphy as they reviewed the case files. But you can't escape your past by stealing from it. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Benedetto, the boarding house landlady, approached O'Brien the day after Marconi's arrest with a confession of her own. Detective, I must tell you something about Rosa. She came to me 2 weeks ago, very upset. She said she wanted to return some money to someone, to make things right. She asked me to help her find a way to send money to New York safely. Did she send it? She tried. She went to Western Union office downtown, but when she got there, she changed her mind, said it was too late for apologies. This revelation painted Rosa's final weeks in a different light. Rather than being callous about the money she'd stolen, she had apparently been struggling with guilt and had considered making restitution. Her decision not to return the money may have sealed her fate. Vincent Marconi was ultimately charged with first-degree murder. Despite his emotional testimony about betrayal and abandonment, the premeditated nature of his trip to Chicago and his admission that he had brought a gun specifically to threaten Rose made it clear that he had come prepared for violence. Tony Torino, despite his cooperation in the arrest, found himself under increased scrutiny from federal agents interested in his bootlegging operation. The publicity surrounding Rose's murder had drawn unwanted attention to the Roseland and its basement speakeasy. The trial of Vincent Marconi became a sensation in the Chicago newspapers, with reporters fascinated by the story of the singing criminal and her jealous partner. Rose was alternately portrayed as a victim trying to escape a life of crime and as a heartless thief who had abandoned her partner after stealing his life savings. The jury ultimately decided that regardless of Rose's past actions, she didn't deserve to die for them. Marconi was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, and his associate, Rossetti, received 10 years for his role in various robberies detailed during the trial. The Roseland Ballroom continued operating for several more months, but the speakeasy was permanently closed. Tony Torino eventually sold the building and concentrated on his restaurant business, claiming he wanted to focus on legitimate enterprises. Mrs. Benedetto kept Rose's room exactly as it had been for nearly a year, hoping that someday Rose's real family might come to claim her belongings. When no one ever did, she donated Rose's clothes to charity and kept only a small photograph of the young singer as a reminder of the girl who had dreamed of respectability but couldn't escape her past. Detective O'Brien often reflected on the case in later years. Rose Delacroix represented a common tragedy of Prohibition-era Chicago, someone caught between the violence of criminal life and the impossible dream of complete reinvention. Her beauty and talent had given her a glimpse of a different kind of life, but the methods she used to achieve it had ultimately destroyed her. The case also illustrated the complex moral landscape of 1920 Chicago, where the line between legitimate and criminal business was often blurred. Tony Torino's speakeasy operated openly, protected by corruption and public demand for illegal alcohol. Yet Rose's attempt to escape her criminal past had been sincere, even if her methods were questionable. In his final report on the case, O'Brien wrote, "The victim, Rosa DeMarco, also known as Rose Delacroix, was attempting to construct a new identity built on genuine talent but financed by stolen money. Her killer, Vincent Marconi, was motivated by a combination of financial loss and personal betrayal. While the victim's past actions do not justify her murder, they explain the circumstances that led to her death." The Chicago Rose case became a cautionary tale about the difficulty of escaping one's past, especially in an era when identity was fluid and law enforcement was often corrupt. Rose's story would be repeated countless times during the Prohibition era, as criminals attempted to use their ill-gotten gains to purchase respectability, only to discover that some debts could never be repaid. Years later, when O'Brien had become a captain and was training young detectives, he would use the Rose Delacroix case as an example of how personal relationships and emotions could complicate even seemingly straightforward criminal investigations. The key to solving the case had not been following the money or analyzing the physical evidence, but understanding the human dynamics between Rose and the men in her life. The basement speakeasy where Rose had died was eventually converted into storage space for the ballroom above, but staff and visitors occasionally reported hearing the faint sound of singing late at night, as if Rose's ghost was still performing for an audience that would never abandon her. The Chicago Rose had found the respectability she craved, but only in death when newspaper accounts focused on her talent and her tragic end rather than her criminal past. In the end, she achieved the transformation she had sought in life. From Rosa DeMarco, jewelry thief, to Rose Delacroix, beloved singer whose murder shocked a city. It was, perhaps, the only kind of reinvention that was truly possible in the violent, complicated world of Prohibition-era Chicago. Story 2, The Silver Creek Conspiracy. Marshal Jake Sullivan adjusted his hat against the morning sun as he rode into Silver Creek, the dust from his horse's hooves mixing with the perpetual haze that hung over the mining town. At 35, Sullivan had been a lawman for 12 years, working his way west from Kansas through a dozen boom towns that had risen and fallen with the fortunes of gold and silver. Silver Creek was different, though. It had been thriving for nearly a decade and showed no signs of the bust that usually followed boom. The telegram that had summoned him from Denver was crumpled in his vest pocket. "Mine owner murdered. Need experienced marshal. Town council will pay well. Come immediately." It was signed by Mayor Henry Blackwood, a name Sullivan recognized from newspaper stories about Colorado's mining wealth. Silver Creek sprawled along the narrow valley like a hastily built dream. The main street was a muddy thoroughfare lined with false-fronted buildings, saloons, general stores, a hotel, a bank, and the offices of various mining companies. Above the town, the mountainsides were scarred with mine shafts and dotted with the wooden frameworks of mining equipment. The constant sound of hammering, blasting, and machinery created a symphony of industry that never stopped. Sullivan tied his horse outside the Silver Creek Hotel and pushed through the batwing doors. The lobby was surprisingly elegant for a frontier town, with imported carpets and crystal chandeliers that spoke to the wealth flowing through the community. Marshall Sullivan, a well-dressed man in his 50s, approached, extending his hand. I'm Henry Blackwood, mayor of Silver Creek. Thank you for coming so quickly. Blackwood was a tall, distinguished man with graying hair and the soft hands of someone who made his living with his mind rather than his muscles. His expensive suit and gold watch chain marked him as one of the town's successful businessmen. Mr. Mayor, your telegram mentioned a murder. Indeed, Charles Morrison, owner of the Lucky Strike mine, was found dead in his office 3 days ago, shot twice in the back. The local deputy, well, he's better suited to breaking up saloon fights than investigating murders. We need someone with your experience. Any suspects? Blackwood's expression grew troubled. That's the problem, Marshall. Charles had enemies, but he also had partners and associates who benefited from his success. The situation is complicated. Sullivan nodded. In mining towns, everything was complicated. I'll need to see the body and examine the scene. Of course. But first, let me explain the situation. Charles Morrison discovered the Lucky Strike claim 7 years ago. It's been one of the most productive silver mines in Colorado. But success brings problems. What kind of problems? Claim jumpers, rival mining companies, disputes over water rights, conflicts with the local Indian tribes. Charles was involved in several ongoing legal battles. And then there are the personal issues. Personal issues? Charles was, how shall I put this, a complicated man. He had a wife in Denver, but he'd been living here with a woman named Sarah Chen, who runs the Silver Dollar Saloon. He also had business partnerships that had become strained over the years. Sullivan was beginning to understand why the local deputy had been overwhelmed. Where's the body now? At Morrison's house, Dr. Patterson, our local physician, examined it and confirmed the cause of death. 2 gunshot wounds to the back, fired from close range. The walk to Morrison's house took them past the bustling commercial district and into a residential area where the successful mine owners and businessmen had built substantial homes. Morrison's house was a 2-story frame building with a wide porch and bay windows, a piece of Eastern civilization transplanted to the Colorado mountains. Deputy Tom Watson met them at the front door. Watson was a young man, probably not yet 25, with the nervous energy of someone in over his head. His badge looked new, and his gun sat awkwardly on his hip. Marshall Sullivan, glad you're here. I've tried to keep everything just like we found it, but folks have been asking a lot of questions. Show me the scene. Morrison's office was on the first floor, a spacious room lined with mining maps, geological surveys, and business ledgers. The desk was large and imposing, made of dark wood that had probably been shipped from back east at considerable expense. Behind the desk, dark stains on the wooden floor marked where Charles Morrison had died. He was found face down behind his desk, Watson explained. Whoever shot him was standing right about here. He indicated a spot near the office door. Both bullets went clean through. Sullivan examined the scene carefully. The office showed no signs of a struggle. Papers on the desk were neat and orderly, and an expensive pen lay beside an unfinished letter. A glass of whiskey sat on the desk, barely touched. What time was he found? About 8 in the morning. Sarah Chen came looking for him when he didn't show up for breakfast. She has a key to the house. And when was he last seen alive? Around 10 the night before. He was at the Silver Dollar Saloon, having drinks with some business associates. Left alone, said he had paperwork to finish. Sullivan picked up the unfinished letter from the desk. It was addressed to someone named J. Harrison in Denver and appeared to be about a business matter. As we discussed, the mineral rights survey has revealed significant discrepancies in the original claim boundaries. I believe we should proceed with the legal action immediately, despite the potential complications. Who's J. Harrison? Watson consulted his notes. James Harrison. He's Morrison's lawyer in Denver. Handles all the legal work for the Lucky Strike mine. What about this mineral rights survey the letter mentions? That's been a big issue around here lately, Mayor Blackwood interjected. Several of the older mining claims are being resurveyed by the territorial government. Some of the boundaries were established hastily during the original rush, and there are overlapping claims and disputed ownership. Sullivan could see how such disputes might provide motive for murder. In mining country, a few feet of boundary line could mean the difference between wealth and poverty. I'll need to speak with everyone who had dealings with Morrison, starting with Sarah Chen. The Silver Dollar Saloon was typical of mining town establishments. A long bar, gaming tables, and a small stage where entertainment was provided in the evenings. Despite the early hour, several customers were already drinking, mostly miners coming off the night shift. Sarah Chen was not what Sullivan had expected. Instead of the typical frontier saloon woman, she was a refined Chinese-American woman in her 30s, dressed in an elegant gown that would have been appropriate in San Francisco's finest establishments. She carried herself with dignity and spoke with educated precision. "Marshall Sullivan, I've been expecting you. Please sit down. Can I offer you coffee?" "Thank you, ma'am. I understand you found Mr. Morrison's body?" Sarah's composure faltered slightly. "Yes. Charles always came to the saloon for breakfast at 7:30. When he didn't appear by 8, I went to check on him. I found the front door unlocked and Charles dead in his office." "Did you notice anything unusual? Signs of a struggle? Evidence that someone else had been in the house?" "Nothing obvious, but Charles was very particular about locking doors. He would never have left the front door unlocked intentionally." "Tell me about the evening before. I understand Mr. Morrison was here for drinks." "Yes, he came in around 9 o'clock. He was meeting with his business partners, William Hartley and Robert Green. They've been having disagreements about the mine's operations." "What kind of disagreements?" Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing her deceased lover's business affairs. "Charles wanted to expand the mining operation, dig deeper shafts, invest in new equipment. His partners thought it was too risky, that they should be satisfied with current production levels." "Sounds like a significant dispute." Charles was frustrated. He felt his partners were being short-sighted, that they were missing opportunities to increase profits. The argument at dinner that night was particularly heated. Did Mr. Morrison seem worried about anything else? The boundary survey issue was troubling him greatly. He discovered that part of the Lucky Strike claim might actually belong to the adjacent Golden Eagle mine. He was planning to fight it in court, but it was causing him considerable stress. Sullivan made notes about both the partnership disputes and the boundary issues. Either could provide motive for murder, especially given the amounts of money involved. "Miss Chen, I have to ask about your relationship with Mr. Morrison." "I understand he was married." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger, but she maintained her composure. "Charles's marriage was a business arrangement made when he was young and poor. His wife lives in Denver and has her own social life. Charles and I had a genuine partnership, both personal and professional." "Professional? I own this establishment, Marshall. Charles provided the initial investment, but I run the business. We were planning to expand into other ventures, a hotel, perhaps a theater. Charles believed Silver Creek needed more refined entertainment." This was a side of the victim Sullivan hadn't expected. Rather than the rough-and-tumble mine owner he'd imagined, Charles Morrison seemed to have been a man with broader ambitions and more complex relationships. "One more question, Miss Chen. Do you know of anyone who might have wanted to harm Mr. Morrison?" "Several people, I'm afraid. His business partners were angry about the expansion plans. Marcus Dalton, who owns the Golden Eagle mine, was furious about the boundary dispute. And there was Thomas Brennan." "Who's Thomas Brennan?" "A former employee who Charles fired for stealing. Brennan has been making threats ever since, claiming Charles cheated him out of his rightful share of a mineral discovery." Sullivan thanked Sarah Chen and made arrangements to speak with her again if necessary. His next stop was the Lucky Strike mine office, where he hoped to meet Morrison's business partners. The mining office was a busy place, with clerks recording ore weights, miners reporting for shifts, and wagons loaded with silver ore departing for the smelter in Denver. William Hartley, Morrison's senior partner, was a heavy-set man in his 60s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades in mining country. "Marshall, this is a terrible business. Charles was a good man, despite our recent disagreements." "Tell me about those disagreements." Hartley sighed and poured himself a drink from a bottle on his desk. "Charles had big dreams, maybe too big. He wanted to invest everything we'd made back into expanding the operation. New shafts, more equipment, hiring additional workers. Robert and I felt it was too risky." "Why risky?" "You never know how long a mine will produce, Marshall. We've all seen boom towns go bust when the minerals run out. Robert and I wanted to take our profits while we could, invest in more stable businesses. But Mr. Morrison disagreed. Charles believed the Lucky Strike had years of production left. He'd been studying the geological surveys, consulting with mining engineers. He was convinced we were sitting on a fortune if we were willing to invest in properly extracting it. Robert Greene, the third partner, arrived as they were talking. Greene was a thin, nervous man in his 40s, with ink-stained fingers that marked him as the partnership's bookkeeper. "Marshall Sullivan? Thank God you're here. This whole situation has been a nightmare." "Mr. Greene, I was just discussing the partnership's recent disagreements with Mr. Hartley." Greene glanced at Hartley before responding. Charles had become obsessed with expansion. He couldn't understand that some of us prefer financial security to endless risk-taking. Were the disagreements serious enough to threaten the partnership? Charles had been talking about buying out our shares, Hartley admitted. He said if we weren't willing to support his vision, he'd find partners who would. This was potentially significant. If Morrison had been planning to force out his partners, they would have had strong financial motives for stopping him. "Did Mr. Morrison have the resources to buy you out?" Greene answered. That's what was so frustrating. Charles had been borrowing against the mine's assets to finance his expansion plans. He was leveraging everything, taking enormous risks with money that belonged to all of us. So if something happened to Mr. Morrison, what would happen to his expansion plans? "They'd die with him," Hartley said bluntly. "Robert and I control 2/3 of the partnership. Without Charles pushing for expansion, we can operate the mine conservatively and profitably." Sullivan was beginning to see a clear motive for murder. Morrison's death would solve his partner's financial concerns and allow them to operate the mine according to their preferences. But before drawing conclusions, he needed to investigate the other potential suspects Sarah Chen had mentioned. His next stop was the Golden Eagle mine, where he hoped to meet Marcus Dalton. The Golden Eagle mine was located about 2 miles up the valley from Silver Creek. The operation was smaller than the Lucky Strike, but appeared well managed and profitable. Marcus Dalton was a man in his 40s with the lean build and calloused hands of someone who still worked his own claim. "Marshall, I heard about Charles Morrison. Can't say I'm surprised, given the enemies he'd made. I understand you and Mr. Morrison were having a boundary dispute." Dalton's face hardened. "Dispute? That's a polite word for it. Morrison was trying to steal part of my claim, plain and simple." "Can you explain the situation?" When the territorial government started resurveying the old claims, Morrison hired some fancy surveyor from Denver to examine the boundary between our mines. Suddenly, this surveyor claims that a section of my mine that's been producing silver for 6 years actually belongs to Morrison. Was there any basis for the claim? The original boundary markers were placed during the rush when everyone was staking claims as fast as possible. Some of the surveying was sloppy, but I've been working that section for years, invested thousands of dollars in equipment and labor. What was Mr. Morrison proposing to do about it? He wanted me to either give up the disputed section or buy it from him for $20,000. $20,000 for land I'd already developed with my own sweat and money. Sullivan could understand Dalton's anger. Such a dispute could bankrupt a smaller mining operation. "Were you planning to fight the claim in court?" "I hired my own surveyor, and I was preparing legal action. But court battles are expensive, and Morrison had deeper pockets than me. He could afford to drag it out for years." "Where were you on the night Morrison was killed?" "Right here at the mine. We had a night shift working, and I was supervising the operation. You can ask any of my workers." Sullivan made note of the alibi, but recognized that in mining country, employee loyalty could be purchased. He would need to verify Dalton's story with multiple sources. His final stop before returning to town was to locate Thomas Brennan, the former employee who had reportedly been making threats against Morrison. He found Brennan at a small placer mining operation about 5 miles from Silver Creek. Brennan was working alone, panning for gold in a creek that probably yielded barely enough to keep him fed. He was a man in his 30s with the desperate look of someone whose luck had run out. "You're here about Morrison," Brennan said, without looking up from his pan. "Figured someone would come asking questions eventually." "Mr. Brennan, I understand you had a dispute with the deceased." "Dispute?" Brennan laughed bitterly. "Morrison stole from me, Marshall. Pure and simple." "How so?" Brennan finally looked up, his eyes filled with rage and frustration. 2 years ago, I was working for Morrison as a shift supervisor. I discovered a rich vein of ore in a section of the mine that had been written off as played out. When I reported it to Morrison, he fired me the next day, claimed I'd been stealing supplies. Was there any truth to that accusation? I might have taken some food when my family was hungry, but nothing more than any miner takes. Morrison used it as an excuse to get rid of me so he wouldn't have to share credit for the discovery. Did you have any legal recourse? What legal recourse does a working man have against a mine owner in Colorado territory? Morrison had lawyers and money. I had nothing but my word. I'm told you've been making threats against Mr. Morrison. Brennan's jaw tightened. I told him I'd see him in hell for what he did to me. If that's a threat, then yes, I threatened him. Where were you 3 nights ago? Right here, panning this worthless creek and thinking about what my life might have been if Morrison hadn't cheated me. Can anyone verify that? I live alone, Marshall. Don't have many visitors out here. Sullivan studied Brennan carefully. The man clearly had motive and opportunity, but something about his manner suggested he was more broken than dangerous. Still, desperation could drive people to extreme actions. Returning to Silver Creek as the sun was setting, Sullivan reviewed what he'd learned. He had at least 4 potential suspects: Morrison's business partners, who would benefit financially from his death; Marcus Dalton, who was facing significant financial losses due to the boundary dispute; Thomas Brennan, who blamed Morrison for ruining his life; and potentially others he hadn't yet identified. He decided to spend the evening at the Silver Dollar Saloon, observing the local dynamics and listening to gossip. In mining towns, saloons were often the best sources of information about local conflicts and relationships. The Silver Dollar was busy that evening, filled with miners, businessmen, and the various characters who made their living in boomtowns. Sullivan took a table in the corner where he could observe without being conspicuous. The conversation was dominated by speculation about Morrison's murder and its implications for the town. Sullivan overheard several interesting comments. Morrison had it coming. Man was too greedy for his own good. I heard his partners were planning to force him out of the business. That boundary dispute with Dalton was getting nasty. Both sides were talking about hiring gunmen. Sarah Chen's going to be in trouble now. Morrison was her only protection in this town. This last comment caught Sullivan's attention. He approached the speaker, a grizzled miner named Pete Kowalski. What did you mean about Sarah Chen needing protection? Kowalski looked around nervously before answering. There's been talk, Marshall. Some folks don't like having a Chinese woman running a business in town. Morrison kept them quiet, but now, what kind of talk? Nothing specific, just comments about how things were better when saloons were run by white folks. Morrison had influence, could keep the troublemakers in line. This suggested another possible motive for Morrison's murder. Someone who wanted to drive Sarah Chen out of business and saw killing Morrison as a way to remove her protection. Sullivan spent another hour in the saloon, gathering information and observing the social dynamics. It was clear that Morrison's death had created a power vacuum in Silver Creek, and various factions were positioning themselves to benefit from the change. The next morning, Sullivan decided to examine Morrison's business records more carefully. With Mayor Blackwood's permission, he spent several hours in Morrison's office, reviewing correspondence, financial documents, and mining reports. The picture that emerged was of a man under considerable pressure from multiple directions. Morrison had indeed been borrowing heavily to finance his expansion plans, putting the entire partnership at financial risk. The boundary dispute with Marcus Dalton involved a section of mine that was worth at least $50,000 in silver ore, and the partnership agreement showed that if Morrison died, his shares would be distributed among the surviving partners rather than going to his estate. But Sullivan also found something unexpected: a letter from a mining engineer in Denver warning Morrison about structural problems in some of the older mine shafts. The engineer recommended immediate repairs that would cost thousands of dollars and significantly reduce production for several months. This information cast Morrison's expansion plans in a different light. Rather than being driven by pure greed, Morrison may have been trying to develop new sections of the mine because the older sections were becoming dangerous and unproductive. Sullivan was reviewing the engineer's report when Deputy Watson burst into the office. "Marshal, you need to come quick. There's been another shooting. They ran through the streets to the Golden Eagle mine, where a crowd had gathered around Marcus Dalton's office. Dalton was sitting on the ground, holding a bloody bandage to his shoulder, while Dr. Patterson worked to clean the wound. "What happened?" Sullivan asked. "Someone took a shot at me from the ridge above the mine," Dalton gasped. "Bullet creased my shoulder. If I hadn't bent down to pick up a rock at just that moment, it would have taken my head off." "Did you see the shooter?" "Just a muzzle flash from the rocks up there. By the time I got my rifle and climbed up to look, whoever it was had disappeared." Sullivan examined the shooting site. The trajectory suggested the bullet had been fired from about 200 yards away, a difficult shot that indicated some skill with a rifle. He found the spot where the shooter had positioned himself, along with the brass casing from a .44 caliber rifle cartridge. "Why would someone want to shoot you, Mr. Dalton?" "Same reason someone shot Morrison, I'd guess. This whole boundary dispute has people stirred up. Maybe whoever killed Morrison figures if they eliminate me too, the whole thing will just go away." This was possible, but Sullivan had another theory. If the same person had killed Morrison and shot at Dalton, it might be someone who benefited from the boundary dispute continuing rather than being resolved. As long as the two mine owners were fighting, someone else could be positioning themselves to profit from the conflict. That afternoon, Sullivan decided to pay another visit to Morrison's business partners. He found William Hartley and Robert Green in the Lucky Strike mine office, reviewing production reports with unusual intensity. "Gentlemen, I have some questions about the mine's financial situation." Hartley looked up nervously. "What kind of questions?" "I've been examining Mr. Morrison's business records. It appears the mine has been borrowing heavily against future production." "How serious is the debt situation?" Green and Hartley exchanged uncomfortable glances before Green answered. "Charles was optimistic about our prospects, perhaps overly optimistic." "How much does the partnership owe?" "About $30,000, secured by the mine's assets," Hartley admitted. "If we can't maintain current production levels, we could face bankruptcy." "And the structural problems in the older shafts that the engineer reported?" Now both men looked genuinely surprised. "What structural problems?" Green asked. Sullivan showed them the engineer's letter. As they read it, their faces grew pale. "Charles never mentioned any of this," Hartley said. "We had no idea the old shafts were dangerous." "According to this report, repairs would cost at least $15,000 and shut down production for 3 months. Combined with your debt situation, that could indeed mean bankruptcy." Green slumped in his chair. "Now I understand why Charles was so desperate to expand into new sections of the mine. He wasn't being greedy. He was trying to save the business." This revelation significantly changed Sullivan's understanding of Morrison's motivations and potentially the motives for his murder. If someone knew about both the mine's debt problems and the structural issues, they might have killed Morrison to prevent him from finding a solution that would preserve the business. Who else knew about these financial problems? "Our banker, James Crawford at First National," Hartley replied. "Charles had been meeting with him regularly about extending our loans." Sullivan decided to pay a visit to the bank. James Crawford was a distinguished man in his 50s, with the conservative dress and cautious manner typical of frontier bankers. His office was austere but reflected the prosperity that had come to Silver Creek through mining wealth. "Marshal Sullivan, I've been expecting you. Charles Morrison's death has created significant concerns for several business interests in town. I understand the Lucky Strike mine has substantial debts." Indeed, Charles had been borrowing aggressively to finance his expansion plans. The mine currently owes this bank $32,000. "What happens to those loans now that Mr. Morrison is dead?" "That depends on whether the surviving partners can maintain production levels. If the mine's output declines significantly, we would have to call in the loans. And if the partnership can't pay, we would be forced to foreclose on the mine. The assets would be sold to recover our losses." This opened up an entirely new line of investigation. "Mr. Crawford, would the bank benefit from foreclosing on the Lucky Strike mine?" Crawford looked uncomfortable with the question. "The bank's primary interest is in recovering our loans, Marshal. However, I will admit that the Lucky Strike is one of the most valuable mining properties in Colorado territory. If we were forced to foreclose, there would certainly be buyers interested in acquiring it. Any buyers in particular?" Several mining companies from Denver have expressed interest in expanding their operations in this area. The Colorado Mining Consortium, for example, has been looking for acquisition opportunities. Sullivan made note of this information. A large mining company might have both the motive and resources to eliminate Morrison if it would lead to an opportunity to acquire his mine at a reduced price. Mr. Crawford, has anyone approached you about the potential for closure? I've had some preliminary inquiries, nothing formal, but there has been interest. As Sullivan left the bank, he was beginning to see a more complex conspiracy than he had initially imagined. Morrison's murder might not have been the result of personal animosity or business disputes between individuals, but part of a larger scheme to acquire valuable mining properties. That evening, he received an unexpected visitor at his hotel room. Sarah Chen knocked on his door just after dark, looking nervous and carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Marshall, I need to show you something. I should have given this to you earlier, but I was frightened." She unwrapped the bundle to reveal a .44 caliber revolver and a stack of documents. "This is Charles's gun. I found it in his desk drawer when I was going through his papers. And these are letters that someone has been sending him, threatening letters." Sullivan examined the weapon. It had been fired recently, and one chamber was empty. The letters were printed in block letters, obviously disguised handwriting, and contained increasingly violent threats against Morrison. When did these letters start arriving? About 2 months ago. The first few were just warnings to stop the expansion plans and resolve the boundary dispute, but they got worse. Sullivan read through the letters. The final one, dated just 3 days before Morrison's murder, was explicit. "Stop the expansion or you will be stopped permanently. This is your final warning." "Sarah, why didn't you give these to the deputy immediately?" "I was scared, Marshall. Charles had been receiving threats, but he was also carrying a gun and talking about hiring protection. I was afraid that if I got involved, whoever killed him might come after me too." The gun was significant evidence, but it also raised new questions. If Morrison had been armed and expecting trouble, how had his killer managed to shoot him in the back without a struggle? Did Charles seem particularly worried the night he was killed? Yes, more than usual. He'd received another letter that afternoon, and it had shaken him. He said he was going to end the whole business, one way or another. What do you think he meant by that? I'm not sure, but Charles had been talking about making some kind of deal, some compromise that would resolve all his problems at once. Sullivan spent most of the night reviewing all the evidence and trying to piece together the sequence of events. By morning, he had developed a theory about Morrison's murder, but he needed more evidence to prove it. He decided to set a trap. He asked Mayor Blackwood to call a meeting of all the interested parties, Morrison's business partners, Marcus Dalton, James Crawford from the bank, and Sarah Chen. He told them he was ready to announce his conclusions about the murder investigation. The meeting was held in the town hall, a modest building that served multiple civic functions. As the participants gathered, Sullivan observed their interactions carefully. Hartley and Green seemed nervous but hopeful. Dalton appeared angry and defensive. Crawford maintained his banker's professional composure. Sarah Chen looked frightened but determined. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sullivan began, "I've spent the past few days investigating Charles Morrison's murder, and I believe I've identified both the killer and the motive." The room was silent, everyone waiting for his revelation. This wasn't a crime of passion or the result of a simple business dispute. Charles Morrison was killed as part of a conspiracy to acquire the Lucky Strike mine at a fraction of its true value. Crawford shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but said nothing. The killer knew about the mine's debt problems, the structural issues in the older shafts, and Morrison's desperate attempts to find a solution. By eliminating Morrison, the killer hoped to force the mine into bankruptcy, making it available for acquisition by outside interests. "That's a serious accusation, Marshall," Crawford said. "Do you have evidence to support it?" "I do. The threatening letters Morrison received were designed to increase his desperation and make him more likely to take risks. The killer was counting on Morrison's partners being too conservative to pursue his expansion plans, which would lead to financial collapse." Sullivan paused for effect before continuing. "The killer also made a crucial mistake. Charles Morrison was armed the night he was killed, but there was no sign of a struggle. That means he trusted his killer enough to turn his back on them." "Who was it?" Dalton demanded. Someone who had access to detailed information about the mine's finances. Someone Morrison trusted completely, and someone who would benefit from the mine's bankruptcy. Sullivan turned to face James Crawford. Someone like the banker who held the mine's loans and who had been in contact with potential buyers? Crawford's face went white. This is outrageous. I had no reason to kill Charles Morrison. You had 30,000 reasons, Mr. Crawford, plus the opportunity to facilitate the sale of a valuable mining property to your associates in Denver. You can't prove any of this. Actually, I can. I found the rifle you used to shoot at Marcus Dalton yesterday. It was hidden in the bank's storage room, along with correspondence between you and the Colorado Mining Consortium about acquiring distressed mining properties. This was a bluff. Sullivan hadn't actually found the rifle, but Crawford's reaction confirmed his suspicions. I can explain. I'm sure you can, but first you're under arrest for the murder of Charles Morrison and the attempted murder of Marcus Dalton. As Deputy Watson moved to arrest Crawford, the banker broke down and confessed. He had indeed been working with outside mining interests to acquire valuable properties in Silver Creek. Morrison's financial difficulties had presented an opportunity, but Morrison's determination to solve his problems through expansion threatened to ruin the scheme. Crawford had sent the threatening letters hoping to intimidate Morrison into abandoning his plans. When that failed, he had arranged to meet Morrison at his house under the pretense of discussing loan modifications. Instead, he had shot Morrison and then attempted to kill Dalton to eliminate another obstacle to the conspiracy. The case was resolved, but Sullivan remained in Silver Creek for several more days to help clean up the aftermath. Morrison's business partners, now understanding the true situation, decided to proceed with a modified version of his expansion plans. The boundary dispute with Dalton was resolved through negotiation rather than litigation, and Sarah Chen, no longer needing protection, announced plans to expand her business interests in the growing town. As Sullivan prepared to leave Silver Creek, Mayor Blackwood approached him with an offer to become the town's permanent marshal. Sullivan declined, explaining that he preferred the variety of traveling from town to town, solving problems and moving on. Besides, he told Blackwood, Silver Creek is going to be a peaceful place now that you've got honest leadership and settled your mining disputes. You don't need a gunfighter pretending to be a lawman. The case of Charles Morrison's murder became part of the legend of Silver Creek, a reminder that even in the Wild West, the most dangerous criminals weren't always the ones wearing guns openly. Sometimes the greatest threats came from those who used respectability as a disguise for greed and violence. Years later, when Silver Creek had grown into a proper city with electric lights and telephone service, old-timers would still tell stories about the marshal who exposed the bankers' conspiracy and brought justice to the mining camps. They would talk about how Sullivan had proven that even in the frontier, where might often made right, intelligence and determination could triumph over corruption and greed. Marshal Jake Sullivan rode out of Silver Creek on a clear September morning, his saddlebags containing his fee and a letter of recommendation from the mayor. Somewhere ahead, another telegram was waiting. Another town needed his skills. Another mystery demanded solution. In the American West of 1884, there was no shortage of work for a man who could bring order to chaos and justice to those who thought themselves above the law. Story 3, The Devil's Witness. Magistrate Jonathan Hathorne pulled his woolen cloak tighter against the October wind as he rode through the forest path leading to Salem Village. The trees were ablaze with autumn colors, but their beauty was lost on him as he contemplated the grim task ahead. A message had arrived at his home in Salem town before dawn. Another death in the village, and this one could not be attributed to witchcraft, accident, or natural causes. At 43, Hathorne had served as a magistrate for over a decade, but the witch trials of the past year had tested his resolve like nothing before. He had presided over dozens of examinations, sent 19 people to the gallows, and watched his community tear itself apart with accusations and fear. Now, as the fervor finally seemed to be subsiding, he faced a different kind of mystery, one that might prove even more dangerous to the fragile peace. The body had been discovered at dawn by Thomas Putnam, one of the village's most prominent citizens and a leading voice in the witch trials. Goodman Ezra Corey, a respected farmer and church member, had been found dead in his barn, but the circumstances suggested murder rather than supernatural intervention. Hathorne found Putnam waiting at Corey's farmstead, along with Reverend Samuel Parris, the village minister whose own daughter and niece had been among the first to exhibit the strange fits that had triggered the witch hysteria. Magistrate Hathorne, Putnam greeted him grimly. I fear we face a most troubling matter. Goodman Corey has been foully murdered, and the manner of his death suggests earthly rather than supernatural agency. Hathorne dismounted and followed Putnam to the barn. Inside, he found Ezra Corey's body lying near a pile of hay, a pitchfork protruding from his chest. The farmer was perhaps 50 years old, with the weathered hands and strong build of someone who had worked the land for decades. When was the body discovered? Hathorne asked. This morning, when I came to discuss the purchase of some cattle, Putnam replied. Corey was expecting me. We had arranged the meeting yesterday after Sunday service. Hathorne examined the scene carefully. Unlike the supernatural deaths attributed to witchcraft, this murder showed clear evidence of human agency. The pitchfork had been driven into Corey's chest with considerable force, and there were signs of a struggle in the disturbed hay and scattered farming tools. Has anyone else been in the barn since you discovered the body? Only Reverend Parris and myself. We thought it best to preserve the scene until you arrived. Reverend Parris stepped forward, a thin man in his 40s with the intense gaze of someone who saw spiritual warfare in everyday events. Magistrate, we must consider whether this murder is connected to the witch trials. Goodman Corey had been vocal in his criticisms of some of the proceedings. This was significant information. As the witch trials had progressed, a growing number of villagers had begun to question the evidence and procedures being used. Some had even suggested that innocent people were being executed based on unreliable testimony. What kind of criticisms had Corey expressed? He questioned the reliability of spectral evidence, Parris explained. He argued that the devil could take the shape of innocent people to deceive the afflicted girls. And he was not alone in these doubts, Putnam added reluctantly. Several other villagers have begun to express similar concerns. Hathorne knew that such doubts threatened the entire foundation of the witch trials. If spectral evidence was unreliable, then most of the convictions would be called into question. I'll need to examine Corey's house and speak with his family. Who else lives on the farm? His wife Mary and their son Samuel, who is about 16 years old, Putnam replied. There's also a hired man, John Proctor's younger brother, William. Hathorne noted that John Proctor had been executed for witchcraft just months earlier, despite maintaining his innocence to the end. The connection might be significant. The Corey house was a modest but well-maintained structure, typical of prosperous farmers in the colony. Mary Corey, a woman of perhaps 45 with graying hair and red-rimmed eyes, received them in the main room where a fire crackled in the stone hearth. Good wife Corey, Hathorne said gently, I'm sorry for your loss. I must ask you some questions about your husband's death. My Ezra was a good man, magistrate. He served God faithfully and worked hard to provide for his family. Who would want to harm him? Had your husband received any threats recently? Was he involved in any disputes with neighbors? Mary exchanged glances with her son Samuel, a tall young man with his father's strong build, but his mother's worried expression. Tell him, Mother, Samuel urged. The magistrate needs to know. Ezra had been receiving warnings about his opposition to the witch trials, Mary admitted. Anonymous notes left at our door suggesting that his doubts about the proceedings made him suspect. What did these notes say specifically? They accused him of harboring sympathy for witches and warned that such sympathies might be seen as evidence of his own involvement with the devil. This was a serious matter. In the climate of fear that gripped Salem Village, accusations of witch sympathy could quickly escalate into formal charges of witchcraft. Do you still have these notes? Ezra burned them. He said he wouldn't have such evil words in our house. Hathorne spoke with William Proctor, the hired man, who confirmed that Ezra Corey had been increasingly concerned about his safety in recent weeks. Goodman Corey was a fair master, Proctor said, but he couldn't stay silent when he saw injustice. He believed innocent people were dying, and he wasn't afraid to say so. Did he mention anyone specific who might have threatened him? He was worried about Thomas Putnam and some of the other men who've been most active in pressing the witch charges. But he never named anyone as a direct threat. This was troubling, since Putnam was the one who had discovered the body. Hathorne would need to investigate his movements more carefully. His next visit was to the parsonage, where he hoped to speak with the afflicted girls whose testimony had been central to the witch trials. Abigail Williams, Reverend Parris's 11-year-old niece, was one of the original accusers whose fits had started the entire hysteria. "Abigail," Hathorne said carefully, "did you know Goodman Corey?" "Yes, sir. He was a good man, but he said things that made the devil angry." "What kind of things?" "He said we weren't really seeing witches in our visions. He said the devil was tricking us." "And what do you think about that?" The girl's expression grew troubled. I I don't know anymore, sir. Sometimes I can't tell if what I see is real or just in my mind." This was a remarkable admission from one of the key witnesses in the witch trials. Hathorne realized that the girl's doubts might be spreading to other accusers, which could explain why someone might want to silence critics like Ezra Corey. He interviewed several other villagers who had been involved in the witch trials, both as accusers and as supporters of the proceedings. A pattern began to emerge. Corey had been systematically questioning the evidence and procedures, and his influence was growing among moderate villagers who had initially supported the trials. That evening, Hathorne reviewed what he had learned. Ezra Corey had been murdered by someone who wanted to silence his criticism of the witch trials. The killer had access to his barn and was strong enough to drive a pitchfork through his chest. Most importantly, the murderer had a strong interest in maintaining the credibility of the witch trials. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Mary Warren, another of the afflicted girls, came to see Hathorne privately. "Magistrate, I must tell you something about Goodman Corey's death," she said nervously. "What do you know, Mary?" "I saw someone near his farm 2 nights ago, after dark. I was returning from helping at the Putnam house when I saw a man leaving Corey's barn." "Can you describe this man?" "He was tall and wore a dark cloak. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he moved like someone I knew." "Someone you knew?" I think it might have been Constable Herrick." George Herrick was the village constable who had been responsible for arrests during the witch trials. If he was involved in Corey's murder, it suggested a conspiracy to protect the trials by eliminating critics. Hathorne found Herrick at the village tavern, drinking ale despite the early hour. The constable was a burly man in his 50s, with the rough manner of someone accustomed to using force to maintain order. "Constable Herrick, I need to ask you about your whereabouts 2 nights ago." "2 nights ago? I was at home with my wife. Why do you ask?" "There's been a report of someone matching your description near Ezra Corey's farm around the time of his murder." Herrick's face flushed red. "Who says they saw me? Some hysterical girl having more fits?" The witness seemed quite certain. "Well, they're wrong. I had no business with Corey, alive or dead." But Hathorne noticed that Herrick's hands were shaking slightly, and there were scratches on his arms that could have come from a struggle. "Constable, you've been involved in enforcing the witch trial procedures. How did you feel about Corey's criticism of those proceedings?" "Corey was a troublemaker. He was undermining lawful authority and encouraging others to doubt properly conducted examinations. Did you consider him dangerous?" "I considered him misguided, but that doesn't mean I killed him." Hathorne was not convinced. He decided to search Herrick's house, using his authority as a magistrate to examine the constable's possessions. In Herrick's woodshed, he found a dark cloak with what appeared to be bloodstains on the sleeve. More damning still, he discovered several of the anonymous threatening notes that had been sent to Corey, apparently drafts that had been kept rather than destroyed. When confronted with this evidence, Herrick's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand the pressure we've been under," he said desperately. "The witch trials have been the only thing keeping order in this village. If people like Corey succeeded in discrediting them, we'd have chaos. So you decided to murder him. I went to his farm to reason with him, to convince him to stop spreading his doubts. But Corey was stubborn. He said he would continue speaking out against the trials, no matter what threats he received. And then, we argued in the barn. Corey accused me of being complicit in the deaths of innocent people. He said the blood of the executed was on my hands. I lost my temper and grabbed the pitchfork. You killed him to protect the witch trials? I killed him to protect the village from chaos. Without the trials, there would be no way to deal with the supernatural forces that have been tormenting us." Hathorne felt a deep sadness as he listened to Herrick's confession. The constable genuinely believed he had been protecting the community, but his actions had only added to the cycle of violence and fear. The arrest of Constable Herrick for Ezra Corey's murder sent shockwaves through Salem Village. The revelation that a law enforcement officer had committed murder to protect the witch trials raised serious questions about the entire process. Hathorne used the case as an opportunity to advocate for ending the witch trials entirely. He argued that the climate of fear and suspicion had corrupted the pursuit of justice and was leading to more violence rather than less. Governor William Phipps, who had been growing increasingly concerned about the witch trials, used Corey's murder as justification for dissolving the court of oyer and terminer that had been conducting the witch examinations. The trials officially ended in May 1693, though by then 20 people had been executed and many more had suffered imprisonment and loss of property. Herrick was tried for murder and sentenced to death, but his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment in recognition of his years of service to the community. He died in prison 3 years later, still believing he had acted to protect Salem Village from supernatural threats. Mary Warren and several other afflicted girls eventually recanted their testimony, admitting that they had been caught up in mass hysteria and had accused innocent people. Their confessions came too late to save those who had already been executed, but they helped prevent future prosecutions. Ezra Corey was buried in his family plot with full honors. His widow Mary received compensation from the colonial government for his wrongful death, though no amount of money could restore the husband and father she had lost. Hathorne continued to serve as a magistrate, but the experience of the witch trials and Corey's murder profoundly changed his approach to justice. He became an advocate for higher standards of evidence and more careful procedures in criminal cases. In later years, he would reflect that Ezra Corey's murder had been both a tragedy and a turning point. The farmer's death had demonstrated the dangers of allowing fear and superstition to override rational judgment, but it had also provided the catalyst needed to end the witch trial hysteria. The case became part of Salem's collective memory, a reminder of how quickly a community could descend into violence when fear overcame reason. It served as a cautionary tale about the importance of protecting those who speak truth to power, even when that truth is uncomfortable. Years later, when Massachusetts formally apologized for the witch trials and compensated the families of those who had been wrongfully executed, Ezra Corey was remembered as one of the first voices to challenge the proceedings. His courage in speaking out and his death at the hands of those who wanted to silence him helped ensure that such a tragedy would never be repeated. The barn where Corey was murdered was eventually torn down, but a marker was placed on the site acknowledging his sacrifice. The inscription read, "Here died Ezra Corey, who spoke for justice when others chose silence, and who paid with his life for defending the innocent." It was a fitting memorial for a man whose final act had been to challenge injustice, even knowing the personal cost. His murder had revealed the corruption at the heart of the witch trials and had helped bring an end to one of the darkest chapters in colonial American history. Jonathan Hathorne carried the weight of the witch trials and Corey's murder for the rest of his life. In his final years, he wrote extensively about the importance of protecting legal procedures from mass hysteria and ensuring that justice was based on evidence rather than fear. His descendants would include Nathaniel Hawthorne, the great American writer who would immortalize the Salem witch trials in literature and help ensure that their lessons were not forgotten by future generations. The Devil's Witness, as some called Ezra Corey, had ultimately triumphed over the forces that killed him. His death had exposed the truth about the witch trials and had helped restore justice to a community that had lost its way in fear and superstition. Let the hush of the night wrap around you, and know this: some stories don't end. They drift, they dream. They wait for you to listen again. Good night.